morning is much more about agencies. It's much more about the people that are possibly paid or organised to look after the community. I think Jim's speech will challenge you to think about the role that you play and how the structures that we've put in place to look after the community have maybe eroded some of the things that we used to do because we enjoyed them and because they were part of being a healthy community. For those of you that attended Owen's launch a few weeks ago, Owen spoke of the strength of the community and how important that was and how that was a measure of the values that a community has, holds and represents. Jim's talk this morning will be very similar about empowering the community, but empowering organisations like yourselves to really contribute in a way that complements what the community wants rather than telling the community what it needs. Just before I pass on to Jim, I just want to make it very clear that Jim isn't here to tell you what to do. Otara has a huge number of amazing community projects happening already, has a wonderful reputation for music, for arts, for community action, for community gardens. And what Jim does is he goes around the world telling stories about things that he has seen throughout the world. So one of my sneaky reasons for bringing him over here is actually to show him the wonderful things that are happening in Otara already, so that when he travels the world he talks about Otara projects. And I expect him now to be one of Otara's greatest ambassadors, and someone that goes forth and starts to dispel some of the rumours and myths that Otara has had attached to it over the years. Because the Otara of now is not the Otara of a while ago. The Otara that people speak of and they read about in the media is not the Otara that we all know when we're here wandering through the town. So as well as all the wonderful work that you guys are doing, Jim, I hope you will welcome him as being one of the new ambassadors for Otara as he travels the world. And I hope over the course of the day some of you get a chance to share your stories about the great work that you're doing in the community. So I'll pass over to Jim, and thanks very much for coming along. I really appreciate it.
Thanks.
Kia ora, Tefano. Yeah. It's great to be here. Yeah, it is a spectacular community, and we had so many people out last night who were just so passionate about this place. I love to see that. I think there's so much to build on, and the turnout today is fantastic. So I think we can take this great place to even higher heights. So look forward to working with you over the course of the day. How many of you, I see some familiar faces from last night. How many people were here last night? Okay, so I got a few, you have to bear with me a little bit. I got a few things I'm going to repeat from last night, just because I want to lay some context. But last night I really talked about why community is so important, and I want to re-emphasize that today. And I talked about if we're going to build partnerships between agencies and communities and really do our very best work, it requires a paradigm shift on the part of both community and agencies. So yesterday I talked about how community needs to change. That if communities really are going to be at their best, they need to step up. They can't just wait for agencies to do everything. They need to recognize their strengths. They need to build broad and inclusive engagement, so it's not just a few people speaking for the community, but it really is broad-based engagement across the community. And today I really want to focus on how agencies need to change if they're going to be supportive of those communities and help those communities be the best they can be. So I'm going to start off by just relaying some of the key messages from last night. And the first one is why community is so important. Why we need to focus on community. And I believe that there's a role for government and there's a role for agencies of all kinds, nonprofits, but there's no substitute for community when it comes to the things we care most deeply about. That there's some things that are best done by community. And one of those is just the power to care for the earth. That we aren't never going to get through climate change if people don't start thinking of themselves as community members, if they don't start connecting with one another in the place that they share, if they don't feel some sense of responsibility for their actions, some accountability, some sense that collectively their actions are going to make a difference, right? So this is a story from our Ballard neighborhood in Seattle. Seattle has about 600,000 people, but when I'm talking about stories from our neighborhoods, there are about 5,000 or 10,000 people, just to give you a sense of the scale. So actually smaller than this community. So this is in Ballard. Ballard is the neighborhood in Seattle that had the least number of street trees of any neighborhood in Seattle. I don't know if the story is true or not. It was largely a Scandinavian neighborhood, and they said when the Scandinavians came to Ballard, they were so tired of not seeing the sun that the first thing they did was chop down all the trees. I don't know if that's true or not, but they had the least number of street trees, and they also had the least number of parks. And there was a woman there named Drvilla Gowan who cared passionately about trees. She wanted to see trees up and down the streets. So she put notices in the church bulletin. She put them in the Ballard News Tribune, the local paper. She put them in the corner grocery store, advertising for other people, trying to recruit other people who shared her passion. And she tried to find somebody in every street in Ballard who shared her passion. And if nobody came forward, she would go knock on every door until she convinced somebody that shared her passion for street trees. And then she turned in her matching fund application. I'm going to talk about her matching fund program in a little bit. Along with all these pledges of volunteer labor, and trucks pulled into her neighborhood one day with 1,080 trees. They dropped them off at every block in Ballard. Drvilla knocked on the door of the block captain, said the trees are here. Block captain knocked on the neighbors' doors, and that day over 1,000 people came out, planted trees up and down the streets. People felt incredibly empowered. Beginning of the day, there's no street trees. The end of the day, we had tree-lined streets. They weren't big trees, but there were trees up and down the streets. Everybody got involved. You can see even the dogs watering the tree. Then they said we still have the least number of parks of any neighborhood in Seattle outside of downtown. So they walked around the neighborhood looking for potential park sites. Had a hard time finding them because the neighborhood's very developed. And they finally found this rundown house that used to serve as a nursery. And it was a huge public safety problem right next to the business district, a lot of drug deals going down there. And they convinced the city to buy that property for a park. The city had money to buy the property, but absolutely no money to design or build the park. So the neighbors did it themselves. Local landscape architect volunteered her services and worked with the other neighbors, and they designed and built Baker Park. Here's the entranceway into the park, some of the landscaping. Had some beautiful old trees in this park, and one of those was one of those monkey puzzle trees with the weird limbs. It had died. They're trying to figure out how to remove it. And one of the neighbors, who was Native American, had a better idea and carved it in place as a totem. And here's some of the detail. Sort of a bear with a frog in its mouth, kind of a symbol of returning nature to the city. This group went on and built a community garden the next year. This is now one of 85 organic community gardens we have in the city of Seattle, with 7,000 urban gardeners, and collectively they donate 15 tons of organic produce to our food banks every year. And this is their most recent park, site of a former house, so to commemorate the house, they built all the furniture out of cement. And at the dedication for this park, they unveiled a timeline that shows the 20 parks they built over the past 20 years. Every one of them with volunteers. They've renaturalized natural areas. They're restoring a salmon estuary. They're building playgrounds. They're building ball fields. They're working with the kids to build a skate park. 20 parks in 20 years, all with volunteers. They said, well, this is great. We've made our neighborhood a much better place, but we're concerned about what's happening to the planet. We're concerned about climate change. So they organized an all-volunteer group called Sustainable Ballard. And they have a big event each year they call Sustainable Ballard Fest, where they invite everybody in. They have music. They got food to get people to come in. And when people come, the first booth they go to is the undriver's license station, where you go and you check all the ways you will not drive over the next month. So this is Julia Fields, the one who organized it. When you do, you get a laminated undriver's license. So she says, I'm going to walk, I'm going to bike, I'm going to take transit, I'm going to take the train. And when you get your undriver's license, it entitles you to drive the shuttle bus, which is a foot-powered mobile going down the streets of Ballard, gets everybody's attention, gets people thinking, what could I do to get out of my car? What could I do to reduce my carbon footprint? This has created a movement now. Now we have 67 of these organizations. All the neighborhoods around Ballard, all suburban communities have organized, and collectively they call themselves Scallops. Tens of thousands of people are active now. And it all started with Drvilla Gowan and those street trees. There's incredible untapped potential in our communities. Incredible if we just allow the communities to get organized and do some things for themselves. Second unique power of communities, the power to prevent crime. We could have police officers in every street, and we wouldn't feel as safe, and it certainly wouldn't be as appropriate as neighbors just watching out for each other, right? So this is a story from Limerick, Ireland. There are 4 social housing communities in Limerick, And one of those is named Ballinacora Weston. And my colleague Cormac Russell grew up in that. His family was there for several generations. And he and I went back and did some work with that community. They had a huge issue with gangs, violent gangs. Been several murders in this neighborhood. Here are pictures of the gang members. And the government solution was, we're going to go in and buy up people's homes and tear them down and rebuild the community. They didn't consult the residents at all. So they started buying up the houses one at a time. Those houses became boarded up, covered with graffiti. Soon there was garbage everywhere. And then with the collapse of the economy in Ireland, there's been absolutely no money to follow through on the plan. Half the housing is vacant, boarded up. People are scared to death to come out of their homes. But on Christmas Eve, a group of young people organized. And they went around house to house Christmas caroling. Incredible bravery, but it gave everybody else the courage to start coming out of their homes. And the young people went to the property across the street, and there was a big field there where all the drug deals were going down, where the gangs were hanging out, and they decided they were going to take that property back. And they went out and they painted out the graffiti. They cleaned up the gutters and the sidewalks. They recruited their parents to help them build planter boxes. They created a mural. And they turned that problem property into what they call the Garden of Hope. And now the residents are going through and renovating those facilities themselves and starting to live back in them. That's the power of community. And third, the power to care for one another. I think one of the silver linings of the economic crisis is that people are rediscovering how important community is. Because at the very time people's needs are the greatest, our agencies have the fewest resources to respond with all the budget cuts. People are realizing all they can really fall back on in an emergency is each other. So this is a story from Wollongong neighborhood in Taiwan. And this is a neighborhood leader. She's so proud of her neighborhood, she's created a fabric map of it. She came up with a great idea and gets each household to put a little placard outside their house that signifies what's special about that family. So her family works in the mines. So she has a miner on her placard. And her neighbor is really into gardening and into art, so that's what she's got on hers. And they take care of the local Buddhist temple. All the neighbors take care of it, make it very green and beautiful. This is all done by neighbors, by volunteers in the community through their neighborhood association. This guy creates this wonderful sculptures that he has in the park next door. And then there was this building that used to serve as a school that was vacant. And the neighborhood association, all volunteers, took that building over and operated it themselves. And they have a child care program, whereas people in the community were taking care of their own kids as a cooperative. Each day, different community members running the program. Really cute kids. They have classrooms, and people are teaching their skills in the classrooms for free. I walked into this room, and hundreds of people just singing their hearts out. And they have a senior center. But it's people taking care of their own elders. And they cook the most delicious food. It's not institutional food, it's community food. And for the elders, for the kids, and everybody interacts there. It's not like the elders are separate from the young people. It's about community. And fourth, the power to demand justice. That no major social change ever happens top down. It all happens bottom up. Every major change. In my country, civil rights movement, the women's rights movement, the gay lesbian rights movement, the environmental movement, the anti-war movement, every major change happens bottom up. And we saw great examples today about the need for environmental justice in this community with what's happening to the fields and the pollution out there and the kind of stuff you'd never get in any other neighborhood that's happening here. And the only way to deal with that is through collective action. So the power of communities to make real change, to push for social justice. This is in London, where the churches and the mosques all joined together to demand that all the employers start paying a living wage to their workers, particularly new immigrants who are being paid substandard wages, can't even afford to live in the city in which they're working, and they're working hard. So they organized, and they're getting the hotels and the hospitals and the university and the City of London to all pay a living wage. And this is why they're able to do it. They've got lots of people engaged. This is one of their meetings. That's the power of community. They were able to get a contract with the Olympics so that everybody working in the Olympics, janitors, everybody, is paid a living wage. And a big chunk of the Olympic Village is going to be turned back to the community for permanently affordable housing, operated by the community. That's the power of community. Communities also, I think, create the best places. If places are just created by council, people tend not to use them, to take care of them, to have much ownership of them. But when the community is helping to create them, it really reflects what's unique about that community, what's special about that community. People feel some sense of ownership. They watch out for it. They don't allow the vandalism. People tend to treat it with more respect, and they program it. Emergency response, we've seen that over and over again, most recently in Christchurch with the earthquake. When there's a disaster, government agencies can't get out there quick enough. We're totally dependent on our neighbors, but people often realize it when it's too late. Our health and welfare, studies show that about 18% of health outcomes can be attributed to healthcare professionals. In many ways, our communities have a bigger impact on our health. They certainly influence our mental health. We're able to deal with environmental issues when we work together as a community to address those. We're able to deal with issues of inequality, all those things that affect our health. Our very happiness is dependent on community, and our democracy is totally dependent on community. The problem is, at the time we most need community, it's in its greatest state of crisis. Robert Putnam, a professor at Harvard University, wrote a book called Bowling Alone, where he tracks the incredible breakdown of community life in North America over the past 50 years. It's a really depressing book for those of us who care about community. It cites lots of reasons. I've added some of my own. Single-purpose land use. It used to be that our families would live, learn, work, play all in the same place. And I know that's a challenge in this community with transportation, because you can't do it all in the same place. You have to transport your kids to the recreation center, or transport them to the shopping center, or commute to work. And when your lives are so scattered, so disjointed, you don't bump into the same people over and over again. And it's hard to build community if you don't bump into the same people over and over and over again. Increased mobility. Used to be our families, generation after generation after generation, would live in the same village. And now how many people here have moved more than 5 times over the course of their life? Right? And when you're always moving, it's hard to build relationships. And if you know you're just going to move again, why bother? It's a lot of work. Right? Longer work days, fear in many places where people are living behind closed doors. And the more you're behind the closed door, the more fearful you become because it's fear of the unknown. Electronic screens. People say they don't have time for community, and yet they spend an average of 3 or 4 hours a day in front of the television set. Just spoke at a conference in Banff, Alberta. There was a researcher who reported that young people are spending an average of 10 to 12 hours a day in front of screens of all types. And social media can be a great thing to reinforce our personal relationships, but it cannot be a substitute for it. Increasing consumerism, globalization, where decisions and products are made further and further away from where we live. Increasing specialization, where our agencies have organized us the way they're organized. So the youth are separated from the elders, are separated from the people with disabilities, and you can't build community in silos. Increasing professionalization, where we have more and more professionals doing what communities used to do for themselves. Yesterday, we did a workshop for community members in the morning, and somebody said they've got a joyologist in their community. I thought, oh my God, we've even professionalized joy, right? And we create those professionalized positions, and everybody else kind of steps back because they don't know enough, right? They aren't the experts. We've lost that capacity in our communities. John McKnight, who I work with at Northwestern University, talks about how the bereavement counselor moved to his small town and helped everybody with their mourning. And so when that person came in, everybody else stepped back and stopped supporting their neighbors because there was a professional who knew how to do that better. As a result, I think I skipped a slide here. My first slide really talked about the circles of relationships, and that's what community is all about. So there's several circles of relationships. One is the inner circle, which is our most intimate connections. It's with our families. And then the next circle is our circle of close friends. And the next one is just the circle of participation, where people would just see on a regular basis at work or at school. And then the outside circle is our circle of economic exchange, or getting services from businesses, from social service providers, money that's dependent, or connections that are dependent on agencies. And this is what's happened to many of our communities, where we're losing those inner circles because the relationships are all to service providers and not to one another. As a result, John McKnight, Peter Block just wrote this book, and this quote just really hit me hard. We all say that it takes a village to raise a child, and yet in modernized societies, this is rarely true. Instead, we pay systems to raise our children. Teachers, counselors, coaches, youth workers, nutritionists, doctors, and McDonald's. We are often reduced as families to being responsible for paying others to teach, watch, and know our children, and to transport them to their paid child raisers. Our villages have often become useless. Our neighbors are responsible for neither their children nor ours. As a result, everywhere we talk about the local youth problem. There is no youth problem. There is a neighborhood problem. Adults who have forgone their responsibility and capacity to join their neighbors in sharing the wealth of our children. It is our greatest challenge. It's our most hopeful possibility. It's just an illustration to me of how so many people are experiencing community these days. This is a little house owned by a woman in the Ballard neighborhood who lived there for 85 years. Developer owned the property around her, wanted to buy her house so he could tear it down and put in a large development. She said, "I'm not selling." He said, "But I'll give you $1 million for that house." Her house is worth $150,000. She said, "I'm still not selling. My community is worth more to me than $1 million." She was a hero in her neighborhood. The developer responded by building right around her house. That's kind of an extreme example, but I think it's an illustration how so many people are experiencing community these days, where they feel that their places aren't being shaped by the people who live there, by the residents, but they're being shaped by outside money and by outside powers. And how even in places where there's a pretty strong sense of community, there are so many individuals who are disconnected, who are isolated, who aren't a part of our community. So I want to talk about steps that agencies, that all of you can take to help rebuild community. Because you're all doing this work because you care deeply about community. You want communities to be at their very best. So I want to talk about steps we need to take to move towards real genuine partnerships with our communities. Okay? And the first step that I think we often overlook is that before we start helping communities, we need to reflect on some of the harm that we inadvertently do to some of the very communities we're trying to help. And here's some of the ways I think agencies of all types can inadvertently harm communities. One is, it seems to me that agencies tend to set the agenda. That we're always going out there organizing people around our agendas, what we're paid to be passionate about, or what we're passionate about, what we got a grant for, and organizing people around those issues, and it leaves very little time for the community to organize themselves around the issues that are most important to them. We're always setting the agenda. Secondly, and I say we because I've worked in lots of agencies. I was director of a city department. I directed a community development corporation. I was part of the problem. Secondly, don't force the community into the bureaucracy silos. So the strength of agencies is that we really have that expertise and that laser-like focus on what's important to us, whether it's domestic violence, or whether it's the environment, or whether it's youth or seniors. But that's not the way our communities are organized. In communities, everything comes together. People look at things much more holistically. Third, don't take people's time without showing results. I think government, and I worked in government, is particularly guilty of this, but oftentimes do lots of public process, lots of public meetings, lots of input, But it's not always clear how we're using that input. And I don't think they've always thought ahead how we're going to use that input. So people come, they participate a lot, and they don't understand a connection between their participation and any kind of results. And even if there are results, we often don't feed back to people, we did this because of what we heard from you. And if people don't see a connection between their participation and some kind of results, they're going to learn it doesn't pay to be involved. They're going to step back. I think we've turned so many people off from community engagement through our processes. Fourth, don't make the community dependent. I think, again, well-meaning agencies often reward people in the community, say, you're working really hard, we're going to start paying you for doing the work that you were doing as a volunteer before. And there's some merit in that, but the problem is when we pay somebody to do that work, pay a leader, everybody else steps back because now it's this person's job. And then when we have budget cuts, and we're getting huge budget cuts in the United States now of all those nonprofits, those positions are the first ones to get cut. And the community's lost its capacity to do things for themselves. And then fifth, don't undermine the community. The iron rule, I started as a community organizer, and the iron rule of community organizing was never do for people what they can do for themselves. That's the hardest rule for any of us to learn because we're all doing this work because we care deeply about our communities. But often in our efforts to help the communities, we've taken away all their agency, all their power, because we're doing for them what they could do better for themselves. So when I was doing community organizing, I was trying to bring people together to have a strong voice with city government, trying to bring mass numbers together. And I was working with people who'd never been active before in their communities. And I remember one guy went to the city council and he went to testify at a city council hearing. And he was so nervous, he took the microphone and he put it in his ear and started talking. And I wanted to jump up and rescue that guy and give his talk for him. But if I'd done that, I would just reinforce the lesson that he has no power, that he's totally dependent on an outside professional. When I first started working, I was working so hard at my job, and I met with my mentor in the first week, and he says, Jim, tell me what you did not do this week. I said, what do you mean, what I didn't do? I was working really hard. He says, but the point is, your job is to help empower the community. Your job is to help rebuild the capacity of community, to build leadership. It's not to do for the community. It's not to advocate for the community. It's to help the community itself have its own voice. Tough lesson to learn. And I'm not one of those people, I'm not one of those Tea Party people from the United States who thinks we need smaller government or fewer nonprofit organizations. We all have more than enough work to do. So I'm just suggesting that we focus our resources on what our agencies do best. There's a reason we have our agencies, because there's some things communities don't do so well, right? So focus our resources on that and use the rest of our capacity to rebuild the capacity of communities to do what they do best, okay? The second step in moving towards partnerships is to remove agency barriers to partnerships. So I think there's all kinds of barriers that we put up to really getting the community actively involved. One is decisions tend to be made at a very centralized level. Now that Opland is much larger, it gets made, centrally, and people tend to be active at a very local level, on their street, in their neighborhood. And if decisions are being made at this level and the community is active at this level, there's disconnect between where people are active and where decisions are being made. So the more we can drive as many decisions as possible down to the lowest possible level, then people can really be engaged and be empowered. Secondly, oftentimes in the name of standardization, efficiency, treating everybody equally, we treat every place the same. And we use cookie-cutter approaches, and it doesn't recognize the unique cultural character of the people or the physical character of the place. Third, inaccessibility. That oftentimes our offices are located in a central place and people have a hard time accessing those. Language. Not just different, there's many different languages in this community, but even if everybody's speaking English, we need to be clear we're speaking the same English that the people are speaking. And increasingly we use our specialized, professionalized language, use really fancy terms like asset-based community development to mean something really simple, which is just build on your strengths. And when people don't know what we're talking about, they don't get engaged. They don't feel like they know enough. Oftentimes we're working the same hours that our community members are working. That makes it hard for them to engage with us. Bureaucratic red tape, health and safety issues. Keeps a lot of people from getting engaged in community. It's legitimate issues, but how do we work through those to really help communities be able to step up and do things again in their communities? And know-it-all attitude. Again, not apologizing for the expertise that we have in our agencies. It's very valuable. But recognizing there's incredible expertise in our communities. Incredible expertise, often of a different kind, where they know their history, they have their relationships, they know their priorities, they know their culture. And when you bring those two kinds of expertise together, you get the best possible outcomes. And then third, to actually rebuild the community's capacity. So providing leadership training to community. We often have lots of training within our agencies, but how do we make that same kind of training available to our community members? We have high expectations of them, and yet we often don't give them the tools to be as effective as they could be. To assist with outreach tools like translation. We often have those tools within our agencies, but do we make them available to the associations in the community so they can connect with each other? To work with associations of all types, that oftentimes the only associations we work with are the ones that are organized around our agenda. So we deal with a very narrow group of people. And if we really want to reach out to the whole community, we need to recognize all the other networks in the community and reach out to those as well. To offer a non-meeting option, to provide forums for networking. So there are many different, it's not like there's one community out there. There are all kinds of different networks in the community. There's lots of different factions in the community. Just as agencies tend to be organized into discrete functions, which makes it hard for the community to work with the agencies, communities are often in factions, right? And it's really hard to work with a community when it's lots of different factions in the community. So how can we help them to start networking, to get to know each other, to start building relationships, to work out a common vision, to work out consensus? Because then the community makes it much easier for the community to partner with our agencies. To offer non-meeting options for engagement. I talked about this some last night. I said, you know, the only option we usually give people for engaging in community is to come to meetings. That's the worst possible option. A few people like to go to meetings, but most people don't. They don't see many results from meetings. They know, they come to that first meeting, they're going to be in the sign-in sheet, and they're going to be sentenced to meetings for the rest of their lives. Right? So if we really want to get people engaged, we need to use all the different tools. We know that social functions really work. Food, music will get people engaged. Because the point is to build relationships. The point isn't who can endure the most suffering, right? And yet we always resort to meetings as a way to build community. Or projects is a great way to build community. Because with projects, unlike with meetings, there's always a result. And there's a role for everybody, for young people who would never come to the meetings, and for elders, and people with disabilities, people from all walks of life. To share stories of successful communities. This is one we really need to do a lot better job of. The media, we're talking about that this morning, the media do a terrible job. They always talk about what's wrong in our communities because that's what sells papers. And that's what, and they sort of focus on the abnormal, right? But when that's in the papers all the time, people start thinking of that as the norm. That's the way our community is because that's all we read about in the papers. I think one of the great things about social media is it gives us an opportunity to get some of the other stories out. I was just in a community in England where they decided to create online to get people to share their stories about community, the power of community. And they're trying to get 3,000 stories from one small community. They're calling Jubilant Stories and getting people to send in their stories. Because stories are the lifeblood of community. Stories about the power, to remind people about the power of community, to give people ideas about what they might do themselves. And there's so many wonderful stories in this community. We need to raise those up so people are aware of them, to recognize the people who really make this community work, and to inspire other people to step up and do similar work. To highlight community strengths, that too oftentimes we just focus on the needs of the community, and then the community starts internalizing that map of itself and forgets about its strengths. And to move beyond citizen participation to community empowerment. So citizen participation is really about involving citizens in our priorities through our processes, And community empowerment is how do we support the community around their own priorities through their own associations. Fundamental difference. So I just want to illustrate one way we did this with my work with the Department of Neighborhoods, which we started in 1988 in the city of Seattle. It's a department of the local council, an area of about 600,000 people. First time a department been organized the way the community was organized, by neighborhood. And it allowed us to do work in a very different way. So we had 32 different departments, like just about every council does. One for police, and one for parks, and one for housing, and one for arts, and one for the streets. And the first time a department been organized by neighborhood. So what we realized was if we're really going to work effectively with the community, it really required a paradigm shift. And this just shows the power of looking at the map in a new way. Right? And I think three major shifts are needed. The first one is, how do we move from siloed thinking, which is the way agencies are organized, to focusing on whole places? It is absolutely impossible for the community to partner with us the way we're currently organized. How many different agencies are there just in this community? You told me the number.
About 1 million?
About 1 million, yeah. So all these local agencies, plus you've got council with all its departments. You've got so many agencies. In the city of Seattle, we had 32 different departments. Then we have our county government with all of its departments. Then we have our state government with all of its departments, our federal government with all of its departments. And then we have hundreds and hundreds of nonprofit organizations. And every one of them is trying to reach out and engage the community. They're being engaged to death. There's not enough nights in the year to go to all those meetings. And it's not the way people experience community. They don't experience community in silos. It's one of the powers of neighborhood or community approach is it's in neighborhoods that everything comes together. You get a much more holistic approach. You get much better solutions than come out of very narrow agencies. So it's really backwards. Our communities now are organizing themselves the way our agencies are organized. Who's serving whom? So if we really want to work with communities, we need to figure out how do we organize ourselves, not just along vertical lines, but also organize horizontally by place so that we can work effectively with our communities. So here's an example of how we did that with the Department of Neighborhoods. We created what we call little city halls, where people could do business with city government right in their own neighborhood, where there's a storefront office where you can go in and do any kind of business with any department of the city or the state. You can apply for a passport there. It's largely low-income people who come in who are having a hard time paying their public utility bills. And because they're having a hard time paying their public utility bills, they often need food or they need shelter, they need other services. So we're really tied into all the agencies. One-stop shop for all the agencies. But the best resource we have there is what we call a coordinator. And that coordinator is somebody who worked for me in the Department of Neighborhoods, works for government, but also works for the community. They often call themselves overt double agents. They're really clear. They're working for both government and the community. And their job is to help connect the two. So they know city government inside and out. They know all the different departments, and they know the state, and they know the county, and they know all the local nonprofit agencies. So when an individual needs services, they have an issue, they often contact the coordinator first. So they don't have to go through all that runaround that you'd get through the bureaucracy. And all the departments and the nonprofits will contact that coordinator first before they start working with the community, because that coordinator has the relationships with the community. They know all the networks in the community, all the different associations. They have that trust. They have those relationships and can help those departments and agencies work effectively with the community. It's a whole lot more cost effective than each agency doing its own outreach, and it's a whole lot more community friendly. Does that make sense? I was in Kootenai in British Columbia, and there they the Human Services that formed a cooperative where all the agencies came together and to share their resources, and they hire one coordinator for each town or neighborhood so that they have one person who can do the outreach for all the agencies. Much more community friendly, much more cost effective. So you might think about an approach like that here. The second step in moving towards partnerships is to move away from this map of our communities and to start looking at this map. So this is the map that agencies create of our communities. Often say that agencies need needs. If there weren't needs in the community, we'd all be out of work. And thank God we have agencies, because there are a lot of needs that can't be addressed adequately by the community. There's a lot of people who'd fall through the cracks. There's a lot of issues that wouldn't be dealt with satisfactorily if we didn't have our agencies. Oftentimes in our effort to help the community, the first thing we do is to do a needs assessment, to figure out what are all the problems in this place. How can we be most helpful? And that's a very legitimate exercise to go through. It's important to identify what those needs are so we can figure out how we can help. The problem is that's often where we stop. And we forget about this map of the communities with which we're working, all of the strengths of that community. Because this map is the basis for partnership. If the community's bringing nothing but needs to the table, all the power is with the agencies. When the community is bringing their strengths to the table, it's about a real partnership. And in many ways, communities have started to internalize this map of themselves because their communities have been labeled as disadvantaged. And they've forgotten about the incredible riches that they have within the community and always looking to the agencies for all the solutions. So if we really want to partner with communities, we really need to raise up this map and remind communities about the incredible strengths that they have. So one of the ways we did this with the Department of Neighborhoods is we started up a program called the Neighborhood Matching Fund. And the idea of this program was to help communities do their own projects, take their own initiatives. And we gave them a little incentive. We said, we'll give you some money if you provide an equal match of volunteer labor. Valued at $10 an hour initially, now it's up to $20 an hour with inflation. I had a really hard time selling this idea to our city council. This is for projects that have been priorities for the community, but had not been a priority for City Hall. So we said, for those kinds of projects, let's meet the neighborhood halfway. We'll provide a cash match from the city in exchange for the community's equal match of volunteer labor. And we want to make this available to any group of neighbors. So this isn't for the incorporated organizations. It's not for the nonprofits. It's just neighbors who want to come together to do a project. And we're only going to fund one-time projects because this isn't for staff. This isn't for operating costs. It's not for rent, because we want to build capacity. We don't want to create dependence. And we want to keep the fund flexible over time. And all the funding decisions will be made by the neighborhood leaders themselves. I took this idea to our council. I asked for $150,000 the first year to implement the program. And it was very controversial. Why should we put any money into projects that aren't our priority? We don't have enough money for everything that is, they said. But finally, on a vote of 5-4, not exactly a mandate, they approved $150,000 for that first year. We supported 22 community self-help projects that first year. They were so successful that the next year, our council voted unanimously to increase the fund to $1.5 million. And they subsequently increased it to $4.5 million a year. So we support about 400 community self-help projects every year in Seattle. We celebrated the 20th anniversary of the Neighborhood Matching Fund 3 years ago in Seattle. And over that time, more than 4,000 projects have been completed. And there's evidence of them in absolutely every neighborhood, greatly reinforcing the quality of life and holding up what's special about each place. The city's $50 million investment over the years has leveraged $70 million in community resources. That under the old model where people were looking to government to do everything, never would have been tapped. But the best benefit is it's newly involved tens of thousands of people in community life, because we finally given people a way to get involved other than going to meetings. So I want to share a few examples of projects that have resulted from that program.
Sorry, Jim, how many projects?
Over 4,000 projects. Yeah. So this is in our High Point neighborhood. This is public housing, largely immigrants from Southeast Asia and East Africa. And didn't you see we're there? Yeah. So this is a community garden that they built themselves, and it's a market garden where the residents are actually allowed to sell the produce to the larger community. So it's a great way for low-income residents to make a little bit of income, but it's also a wonderful way to make connections, to make cross-cultural connections, because they're often sharing food, produce, that the people who are buying it have no idea what it is, right? And so they share recipes, they do potlucks together. Food's a great way to build community. Yeah, here they are, people picking up their produce on Saturday. Every one of our playgrounds in Seattle has been redeveloped by the community, by volunteers, both in our schools and in our parks. It used to be every one of our playgrounds looked exactly the same. I think our Parks Department got a really good deal. But now each playground reflects what's special about that place. So the first playground to be developed was in the Alki neighborhood. And when the neighbors came together to design the playground, some of the kids showed up in wheelchairs. So they built the first wheelchair accessible playground in Seattle. So much innovation comes out of community that would never come out of the bureaucracy. This is in northwest Seattle, where neighbors had worked for 20 years to clean up Piper's Creek to make a better salmon habitat. They educated neighbors about not using fertilizers, about not using pesticides. They revegetated along the creek, took out the invasive plants, reforested with native plants. They built salmon weirs. And one night, after 20 years of work, I got a call from Nancy Malmgren, who was the volunteer leader, and she said, "Jim, the salmon are back." I raced across the city because it's the opposite end of the city, and I got up there and there were hundreds of people out celebrating the return of the salmon because they'd all played a role in making that happen. They said, "Well, this is pretty cool, but now that we got salmon back, we'd like to get kids into our park. We don't have a playground. We need to get kids." So they had a design meeting, and at the design meeting, one of the kids said, "I'd like a salmon playground." The adults are all scratching their heads because nobody had ever seen a salmon playground before. But then a local artist said, "I've got an idea." And he built a 19-foot-long salmon that's so big that you slide in the mouth and you come out the tail. And then you climb into a cave and you climb over boulders, and it gives kids a sense of the struggle that salmon go through to get back to the city of Seattle. So where you go in, and you land in a full rubber sea. All kinds of facilities been renovated through the matching fund. This is a log cabin that was rotting away in West Seattle, and the community renovated it to become an historical museum, all with volunteers. This is a longhouse that was built by our Duwamish tribe recently as a gathering place for their community. And here's the opening ceremony. This is in our Fremont neighborhood, where they're having a huge problem with drug dealing and with illegal dumping underneath the bridge. I think in any other neighborhood, they would have put fences up on either side to keep out the problem. In Fremont, they had a different idea. They got lots of artists. So they said, this space is kind of cool. It's almost like a cathedral with this high ceiling, these big columns. They started calling it the Hall of Giants. And they said, we'd like to get $24,600 so we could put some public art under the bridge. I said, well, what's it going to be? They said, well, we don't know yet. Once we get the money, then we're going to put out a call for artists, and we're going to put the models on display and let the people vote for which one they want under the bridge. I said, man, we can't fund that. We don't even know what it is. But as I said, it's the neighborhood leaders who make all the funding decisions, and they like this idea. So they agreed to fund it. This is the first year of our matching fund when the program was still pretty controversial. So I thought, oh my God, this could be the end of the matching fund. So they got the money. They put out the call for artists. Artists submitted different models for what they wanted under the bridge. Somebody submitted a large throne because they were calling this the Hall of Giants. Somebody else submitted a larger-than-life construction workers and engineers, kind of a tribute to the people who built the bridge. Somebody else submitted a troll. I thought, oh my God, how would I explain to the mayor we're going to use public funds to build a troll under a bridge when we don't even have enough money to take care of all the roads? I thought, this is a terrible idea. So they had these sculptures on display, the models on display at the Fremont Fair. 100,000 people come by, and everybody who comes by is entitled to vote for which sculpture they want under the bridge. I kept going by voting for those construction workers because I figured they're the least objectionable, right? Guess which one won? Yeah, my worst fear. And it got even worse. Because a few days later, the art critic from the daily newspaper wrote a scathing review. She said, this shows the public should never be involved in public art decisions. The people have no taste. This is a terrible waste of public funds. I thought, oh my God, that's it for the matching fund. But her column so incensed the community, they started rallying behind the troll. They started doing street dances to raise money for the troll. The kids wrote a troll rap. I went to the neighborhood one day. There were 10-foot-long footprints up and down the streets of Fremont, like the troll had been walking through the neighborhood. So they raised the money. They built the troll. Here he is. That troll is so big, that's a real VW that he's got there. Sort of an environmental statement, like you lifted it off the top of the bridge. There was some vandalism early on. Somebody broke out the window in the VW. But the neighbors organized. They formed a troll patrol. They put lighting on the troll. They do regular walks around the neighborhood and around the troll to make sure the troll and the neighborhood are safe. And it's what happens when people start to take ownership of their communities again. They don't just call up, if there's problems, they don't just call the city and say, hey, we got problems with your troll. It's their troll. They take care of it. And they program it all the time. And now people come from absolutely all over the world to see the troll. And when they come, they shop in the local business district. But there's always legitimate traffic underneath the bridge, so we don't have a problem with public safety. Again, another incredible innovation that came out of community. Can you imagine the police department saying, hey, we got a problem under the bridge. Let's bring in a troll, right? So here's the keys to success for that program. Is real ownership by the community, outreach beyond the usual suspects. So this isn't funding for all the groups that are looking for grants. This is money for just neighbors who want to come together to do a project. The volunteer match is absolutely what makes this work, so we don't lay the money on whoever's the best grant writer, or the person who's best politically connected, or the person who can show the most need. It goes to the person who can really galvanize their community around a shared vision. Training and technical assistance, minimizing the red tape and paperwork, supported by the council as a whole, and then just sharing stories to inspire people, get people thinking, hey, you know, they created this troll in this neighborhood. What do you want to do to top that, right? So matching funds now are being implemented all over the world, following this model in Seattle. In the UK, they're creating a matching fund that's nationwide because they don't have money. Because they recognize the opportunity to leverage all these resources in the community. They're doing them all over Australia. Sydney's got a matching fund. Port Phillip's got one. Wodonga's got one. Shepparton's got one. And it's just small amounts of money. You don't need much more. You don't need $4.5 million. $25,000, $50,000 would be enough for a matching fund. But it's just a great way to get people engaged in community, rebuild community. So you might think about, you know, implementing one of those here as well. And then the third major challenge is how do we move from top down to community driven? Agencies tend to be top down. They aren't democratic like neighborhood associations. You know, it's the CEO says this is the way we're going to do things, or the board says this is the way we're going to do things. It's very seldom driven by the community's agenda. And again, sometimes the agency needs to drive it because there's some things the community's not paying enough attention to, right? But to the extent possible, how do we help support the community's initiatives? How do we help the community around their own priorities through their own associations? So we started up a neighborhood planning program in Seattle. Neighborhood groups said, this is fantastic. You've empowered us to do single projects through the matching fund. But if you really want to give us power, you give us the power to plan. And I was a little cynical about planning because I'd never seen much happen with plans. You know, it seems like plans usually just sit on the shelf. Does that happen here at all? Yeah. You know, because there's very little ownership of the plans by the community. Usually only the planner owns the plan or understands the plan. So there's really no constituency for the plan. Nobody to hold the council accountable for making sure it gets implemented. So I was kind of cynical about it. But we decided to start up a neighborhood planning program because the neighborhoods were really demanding it. And this is what I see as the keys to neighborhood planning, to successful neighborhood planning. One is that we do it within the context of the council's plan so that we aren't planning in a vacuum. Secondly, that the community can initiate the planning themselves. That always makes all the difference. If it's a project, if it's an idea, if it's a plan, if it's the community's idea, they're going to make it work. If it's the agency's idea, they're always going to look to the agency to implement it. So it makes a huge difference where that initiative comes from. Secondly, the community, we wouldn't fund a community to do a plan until they brought everybody in the community together. We said we are not going to fund just one group within the community. You need to bring all the stakeholders together before we'll fund a plan, because we want to create a whole vision for the community and not just support one faction of the community. Fourth, the city provides funding and technical assistance. Fifth, once the community's done this and brought everybody together, we'll give them money so they can hire their own planner. That makes a huge difference. So when the community hires a planner, they look for somebody who not only has good technical expertise, but somebody who's really good at engaging in the community, and somebody who actually understands the value of engaging in the community. Isn't just going through the motions, but recognizes the incredible expertise that could be tapped, how important it is to tap that perspective of the community. And probably most importantly, that planner is accountable to the community, not to council, but to the community. Makes a huge difference. The community is able to define its own scope of work. So when our city did plans, it was done out of one of those siloed departments, and usually the plan was just about land use or just about capital improvements. And there's nothing more controversial than a land use plan, particularly when it's divorced from everything else. When the community plan, they plan for what's important to them, and it might be public safety, it might be economic development, it might be affordable housing, it might be parks and open space, it might be arts and culture, it might be transportation, it might be education. Usually it's all of those things because communities think so much more holistically than the bureaucracy does. And then fifth, the community drives the planning throughout the process. So when my neighborhood did a neighborhood plan, there were 250 people at the council demanding that that plan be adopted. And we invited the mayor out every year for an accountability session and said, we want to know what you did to implement our plan over the past year and how you've put it into your work program and budget for next year. So a high level of accountability we'd never had for our plans was possible because people put their blood, sweat, and tears into creating these plans. But I think more importantly, the community took a lot of ownership themselves and stepped up and said there's some things we can do ourselves to implement the plan. So a lot of the recommendations are carried out not through city resources, but through community resources. So I want to give one illustration of how this works. This is in our Delridge neighborhood in Seattle. Delridge is a neighborhood unlike our other neighborhoods in Seattle in that it doesn't have a center to it. It doesn't have a business district, right? Delridge is really defined by an arterial, a way to get somewhere else, to White Center. So it's very auto-oriented. It's lined by convenience stores and gas stations. And as a result, there's not much sense of community because there's not that bumping place, that place where people, kind of a center where people can identify with. But because Delridge is largely underdeveloped, it still had the best natural environment of any neighborhood in Seattle. It had a third of the city's green belts, wonderful creek, the longest contiguous creek in Seattle, Longfellow Creek, which is a 4-mile creek, right off of Delridge Way. But as the other neighborhoods became developed and the developers ran out of room, they discovered Delridge. We got some of the worst possible development. Because this is a very low-income community, very multicultural community that wasn't organized, that didn't have any power. So they had no say in what happened to their community. So here's what happened. They ended up with a big box retail built right on top of the creek. And here you can see the development sign going up saying development's coming. And they clear-cut that forest on Delridge Way and replaced it with the worst possible development where all you can see is garage doors instead of front doors. And this is Vivian McLean. Vivian was just sick about what was happening to her neighborhood. Vivian was the most special person. She's a peace activist. She got arrested numerous times at the School of the Americas. She's an environmentalist. She was a school teacher. And she was recently retired. And she was sick about what was happening to her neighborhood. So she said, we've got to do something about this. So as a volunteer, she went around to little pockets of people all over Delridge and started organizing neighborhood associations. She organized a dozen neighborhood associations all over Delridge. Incredible work. And then she pulled them together so they could work together to stop bad development in the community. And they were largely successful at keeping more development away from the creek, at preserving the green belts. But finally she said, you know, I'm putting all my energy into keeping my neighborhood from becoming a worse place. I'd like to put some energy into making it a better place. So in 1995, they organized a community development corporation, and the first thing they did was to do a neighborhood plan and involve the whole community in creating a vision for what their community should look like. And their vision was, we want to get a center to our neighborhood like every other neighborhood has. And we want to get the kind of public facilities that other neighborhoods take for granted, but that we don't have because we haven't had any political clout. And as we make our neighborhood a better place, we want to preserve our natural environment. And as we improve our neighborhood, we want to keep it affordable. We don't want it to gentrify. We don't want to create a better neighborhood for somebody else. We want to create a better neighborhood for the people who live here. So that was their vision. And here's what resulted. Neighbors came together and they removed the invasive plants from along the creek and reforested with native plants to make that really special place. They created a 4-mile trail system along the creek, all with volunteers, to connect people with nature and to connect the neighborhoods with one another, including this wonderful fishbone bridge that spans the creek. They worked with new immigrants and refugees to build community gardens. This is all through community action, using community resources. Then, right in the center of the neighborhood, at Delridge and Brandon, on a vacant lot covered with blackberry bushes, they said, this is going to be the center of our community. And they built a 3-story mixed-use development. The scale was unlike anything else in that single-family neighborhood. And it has retail space, it has a little city hall, and upstairs, condominiums affordable to low-income families, with a common courtyard so that they can create a bumping place and build a sense of community. Then they lobbied the city and said, we want to get a library like the other neighborhoods have. And because it involved so many people in the planning process and had such political clout, the city agreed. But before the city even had a chance, they designed that library themselves. And they invited the city out and said, this is what our library is going to look like, and it's going to be part of our neighborhood center. And because the community was so united, the city agreed. And here's what they ended up with: a library with low-income housing up above it. That's something that would never come out of our city government, because our library department is siloed and it just builds libraries. You get so much more interesting, holistic approaches coming out of community. And I tell you, the families who live here feel so proud. Bill Gates does not have that big a library in his house, right? And they issued 3,000 new library cards in the first 6 months because immigrants, refugees, kids finally had access to a library. There was another green belt that was threatened with development, and they said, we want to show development can be compatible with the environment. So they purchased the 6 acres. They sold 3 acres back to the Parks Department. And with the other 3 acres, they built a fairly dense development for that neighborhood. And it's kind of a co-housing model where the units face each other, where there's a common courtyard to build a sense of community, where there's a common building with computers, with common child care. You can see it's very green with solar panels, lots of recycled materials, natural drainage. But this is housing for low-income families, including 7 families that are transitioning from homelessness, who now have some of the best housing in the neighborhood. There was an old food bank that was just a little shack when you came across the West Seattle Bridge. And people would be waiting, because it was so small, people would be waiting outside in line to get into the food bank, in full view of all the other neighbors as they drove down the arterial, in the rain. They said, we want to treat people with respect. We're going to build a new food bank, and we're going to create other spaces there so we can do job training and help people escape dependence on emergency services. And upstairs, they built another 32 units of low-income housing. Again, with a common courtyard to create that sense of community. But their key recommendation of their neighborhood plan was, we've got this old school, Cooper Elementary School. It's the gateway into our neighborhood. It should be our pride and joy. Instead, it's a symbol of neglect and disinvestment of our neighborhood, because it's been closed and boarded up for 17 years, covered with graffiti. Sends a very negative statement about our community. Any other neighborhood, it would have become high-end condos, would have been redeveloped as a shopping center. Here it just sits. And this is the home of the first African-American school teacher in Seattle. So they organized, and this was their key recommendations. They wanted to renovate this building to make it their pride and joy again. And they had lots of community sessions where they brought community members together to create a vision for how that center should be used. And they voted, they came up with a number of different ideas, but the one they voted on is they said, we want to create a multicultural center to surround our young people with the arts, to give our kids every chance to be successful. They were so excited about the vision that they did a capital campaign to raise money to renovate this facility, and to build that co-housing project I showed, and to build that food bank. They raised $28 million out of this low-income neighborhood through a grassroots organization. And this is how they did it. The board is made up of low-income residents. There was a girl on that board who was from public housing who pledged all of her summer earnings to this project, $1,000. And when the other board members saw her step up like that, they said, we're going to stretch as much as we can. Everybody stretched, and they put in $150,000 from the board, all low-income members of the community. And then we went to the banks, into the foundations, into council, and we said, we stretched as much as we possibly can. We stretched more than we possibly can, and we expect you to do the same. And they did. They stepped up. When corporations, foundations, council sees the community with that kind of commitment, they're much more likely to give than if it's just asking for a handout. So here's what resulted. They renovated this building to become the Youngstown Cultural Arts Center. And they brought in the Interagency Academy, which is a school for kids who have been kicked out of every other school in Seattle, kids who'd had no breaks in their lives. And they brought in the leading youth arts organizations as the anchor tenants. And they fixed up the old gymnasium as a state-of-the-art movement studio where they do hip-hop and where they do breakdance and where they do ballet, all kinds of movement. They put in a recording studio. They fixed up the old cafeteria as a state-of-the-art theater. And the old classrooms are now 37 live-work units for low-income artists. Beautiful spaces where they have high ceilings, big windows, but the artists help program the space down below with the young people. So this is from opening night, some of the artists and some of the young people performing on the stage. There were 3,000 people there. Place is absolutely jam-packed. And everybody was so proud because it was their idea. It was their kids who were performing. They're the ones who'd raised the money for this project. So here's what I see as the value of community-driven planning. That implementation actually happens. The plans don't just sit on the shelf. Resources are multiplied. So in addition to all those resources we have in our agencies, now we have all these resources from the community. Appropriate development occurs respecting the unique character of the neighborhood and the culture of the community. More holistic and innovative solutions result, and a stronger sense of community is built as you bring all the different factions together to create a common vision for their community. So I see the hallmarks of agency community partnerships is if we're really going to work effectively with communities, we need to do our work in a way that is more place-focused, strength-based, and community-driven. So I talked about an illustration from government, and just a couple quick stories about nonprofit organizations and how they've taken this approach. So this is our senior services of King County. Senior Services does all our senior centers in King County. And King County is the largest jurisdiction outside Seattle, so a much larger area than Seattle. And they run our Meals on Wheels program, all the senior centers. Their budgets are being cut dramatically because of the economic crisis. And at the very time, our population is quickly aging. So the needs are growing like this, and the resources are going like this. There's a disconnect. So Denise Klein, who's the head of Senior Services, said, rather than just do business as usual and just keep doing less and less and less and less of what we've been doing, let's figure out a new way of engaging the community. And she decided to take more of an asset-based approach. Instead of just seeing seniors as clients, let's start looking at their strengths. So we organized gatherings all over King County that we called Aging Your Way. And in each town, in each neighborhood, we had a gathering. Had about 75 people there, and we invited in the baby boomers, people like me. And Denise, head of Senior Services, started out by asking people to close your eyes and think about when you are first old. That really shook me up. I never thought about that before. Never wanted to confront that issue. But you close your eyes, think about when you're first old, and what kind of services do you need? What kind of contribution are you making? How are you fitting into your neighborhood? And here people are contemplating that question. And then I had people do a little brainstorming, thinking about what would your neighborhood or your community need to look like in order to allow you to age in the way you would like. What would a senior-friendly community look like? And then gave people a big piece of paper, and collectively around their table they would draw a vision about what would a senior-friendly community look like. And here they are presenting their visions. And their visions were so much broader than what would have ever come out of that agency. Because the number one things, the key things we heard was we want the opportunity to interact with young people. Something that never happens in senior services. We want the opportunity to contribute. We've worked a whole lifetime to learn, to gain skills and knowledge, and now we're just seen as clients. We got a lot to offer. We want to contribute to our community. We spent a whole lifetime screwing up the environment. And now we want to pay it back. We want to live in a green community. We want to have a walkable neighborhood because we'll have issues getting around. So they created these visions, and then we had graphic artists who put them all together to create a composite vision for the neighborhood. And here it is. This is just out of one of the gatherings. And then people who created this vision came up with actions they could take that would help move towards that vision. So it wasn't just creating a list of things for the agency to do. It was identifying things they could do to create a more senior-friendly community. So they came up with things like neighborhood walking map, a planning for senior co-housing, gay, lesbian community projects, a one-stop lifelong learning website, this maintenance project where they worked with kids in the school to clean up the woods and the paths around the school. They created a time bank where everybody's time is valued exactly the same and people share their skills with one another, particularly across generations. Young people are helping drive older people to the doctor's appointment or teaching them how to use a computer. And older people are helping young people learn a craft or learn a trade. My favorite project they came up with was an intergenerational multicultural dance party. This is out of my neighborhood. They said, the strength of our community is it's very multicultural. So why don't we have a big party and just share our dances with each other? Because we all have our own kinds of dancing. So people came from 12 different cultures, and everybody shared their dance. And so people from all generations and all cultures were dancing together. You can see all generations here. She was our DJ. But people had so much fun. They said, can we do this again next month? And now they're just having their 7th one next month. And the numbers of people just keeps growing. And finally, just a story from our High Point neighborhood in Seattle. High Point is a neighborhood in Seattle that is a social housing community, very multicultural, people from all over the world. But it's one of those places where I think we have more agencies than we have residents. And people are so used to, when they have a need, to always looking to the agencies to address it. There was one of those agencies, Neighborhood House, that got a grant to create a healthy community. And so they're trying to figure out, how do we involve the residents? Because that was a requirement of the grant. Nobody would come to their meetings. So they finally started paying people to come to their meetings. Kind of sick. Right? And so they formed an advisory committee, and they met with them, and they asked them to come up with a list of things they could do to create a healthier community. And all they did was come up with lists of things for other agencies to do. But those agencies didn't, their budgets are being cut. They didn't have any resources for new initiatives. So we tried to figure out, what are we going to do? I said, could you get some of your neighbors involved? And they said, they really don't care that much about fitness or that much about nutrition. We're always trying to engage the community around our priorities, right? If we follow their priority, they're much more likely to get engaged. So I said, what do you guys care about? They said, we just want to create an awesome community. I said, okay, how about if we have a big gathering about what would an awesome community look like and how do we get there? They said, okay. I said, what would get people to come? They said, if we had food, people would come. I said, well, I got a little bit of money. I could pay for the ingredients for the food if you could cook it. So we had food from absolutely all over the world. It was the most multicultural feast you can imagine. People were so proud to be able to serve their own food. And then they said if we had entertainment, people would come. I said, what kind of entertainment's in the community? And there was a senior who said, I'm part of a line dance group. And so they came out, and some of them even had walkers. They were out there doing their line dance with their walkers. But the kids loved it, jumped up and joined them and said, can we do this with you every month? And then had people do a little brainstorming about what would an awesome High Point community look like? And what kind of actions could help you move towards an awesome High Point community? And this woman said, I'm from China. I'd love to start up a tea house as a sort of a bumping place, a gathering place where neighbors could get together. And there were some Somali elders in the corner who said, we don't drink tea, we drink coffee. She said, okay, we'll have a tea and coffee house. So here they are planning it together. This guy said, I love to exercise. I'll lead exercise classes, but I'm a terrible organizer. If somebody helped me organize the classes, I'll lead them. So a group of people joined him to help organize the exercise classes. And this young woman said, I love to play soccer, but because of my religion, I can't play outdoors. I want to start up an indoor soccer league. So that's underway. This woman said, we made this incredible feast tonight with food from all over the world. That's our gift as a community. I'd like to start up a multicultural catering company as a way to make some income for low-income residents and a way to share our gifts with the larger community. What other catering company could come up with such a diverse range of food? And this guy, Solomon, was the most articulate. He was just amazing. He just stood up there. He was so calm. He just says, you know, all my friends in all the other neighborhoods have wonderful parks and playgrounds and swing sets. I want a swing set. And there were some elders in the corner who said, you know, we do regular walks around the neighborhood. We get tired. We just want to create, we'd like a bench. How about if we create a park with a swing set and a bench? 6 months later, they came together and they started building that park. They're building the bench. And they built the swing set. And here's Solomon in his new swing set. But that's the power. That's the power. When agencies start to work in a new way and start to focus on whole places, on the strengths of the community, and allow the community to take some initiative and help support those initiatives. And I tell you, it makes our job so much more satisfying when we can rebuild those social connections among people, give people a sense of their own power, help people not feel dependent. It's better for all of us. So I really look forward. Thanks for sitting through this morning. This afternoon we're going to do a workshop based on some of these ideas. And this afternoon what I really want to do is talk about what are, and have you involved in identifying what are the real strengths in this community that we can build on. And then we're going to do a process very similar to what we did in High Point and with the senior services, where we're going to do open space. And if you have an idea for a project you want to work on, or you have an idea for an issue you want to address, you know, like how do we support young people in our community, or if you have an idea about how agencies could work better together in support of the community, we're going to do open space so you can stand up and champion your idea and try to get other people to join you to start working on that idea this afternoon. So I'm hoping some things will come out of the session this afternoon. I think they modeled it really well in High Point, and I think you guys can do at least as well. So I look forward to working with you this afternoon. Thanks so much.
Ba-da-ba-ba